Roastar Coffee Packaging, found online at roastar.com, prints great-looking bags for a host of your favorite coffee companies of all sizes, who trust Roastar to produce packages worthy of their specialty coffee beans. It's Roastar's mission, their ethos, to help their customers tell their stories, big or small. That includes those of you roasting coffee at home. If you're a small home roaster wanting to share your coffee with friends, family, and your coffee community, Roastar will support you too. Head to roastar.com to learn more about their quick turnaround times, digital printing, and small print runs, or use their design lab to create an entirely new package in the blink of an eye. In short, Roastar can help you, and on roastar.com, you can start with a quote and end with the perfect coffee bag to share your story. Now, on to the show. Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Season 11, Episode 9 of the Coffee People podcast, which is part of the Roast West Coast Coffee Network and presented by Roastar Coffee Packaging. I'm Ryan Woldt, and this is the show where we meet and chat with coffee people. Today, I'm chatting with George Vukasin Jr. He's the CEO and coffee buyer of the 2019 Roast Magazine Roaster of the Year, Peerless Coffee Tea in Oakland, California. George is part of the third generation running Peerless, which is celebrating a century in business. To share their excitement about the achievement, they released an organic, regeneratively produced centennial anniversary blend of Colombia and Nicaragua coffees. More on that later. While you're listening to the podcast today, be sure to check out peerlesscoffee.com and Peerless Coffee on social media. You'll find the links in this podcast's show notes wherever you're listening, or in our newsletter, found at coffeepeoplepodcast.com. That's coffeepeoplepodcast.com. Our guest, George, is a pretty busy guy. During today's episode, you'll hear his phone and intercom for just a few moments in the background of our chat, and since he works in a coffee roasting facility, the sound of coffee beans being poured into a hopper adds a bit of charm to the reality of being an entrepreneur. Speaking of being an entrepreneur, thanks to everyone who's been clicking the Buy Us a Cup of Coffee link in the show notes. Your coffees have helped keep me caffeinated through the production of this show. The coffee I'm drinking right now is actually from Peerless, and it is their centennial blend that I brewed in a French press this morning. The tasting notes are dark chocolate and dried berry, and they are strong with this one, like Luke's Jedi power strong. Wherever you are, I hope you're drinking a flavorful cup of coffee too, perhaps out of your favorite coffee mug. Enjoy it while listening to this episode of Coffee People, featuring George Vukasin Jr. of Peerless Coffee and Tea. Here we go. Well, let's get going. I would start by asking you if you could let everyone listening know what's your name and your company and what you do there.
I am George Vukasin Jr., and I am owner and president and coffee buyer, Peerless Coffee and Tea, which is my family's third generation coffee roastery here in Oakland, sunny Oakland, California.
I normally start these shows by asking a little bit about the backstory. In your case, I kind of already, what was the first experience you had with coffee? I imagine you were born onto a bed of green coffee, having learned that there are 3 generations of this company going. But I'm going to ask it anyway.
Sure.
Do you have kind of early memories of coffee that got you started or got you excited about it? Because it's not often that people get real excited about what their parents do.
Yeah, no, I have very early memories. The original, so we're in a building, was my dad's office. That was built in 1975. The original Peerless was about 10 blocks closer to downtown Oakland. And my earliest memory would be if my dad had to roast on a Saturday or Sunday, he'd keep an eye out for me, bring me in, empty burlap bags, empty green bags would be stacked up. He'd put me down there. That's what I would take my nap on. And while he was roasting or cupping or whatever he was doing. So, it really started back then. But better knowing the process was was definitely here. We have a cupping room, which my dad built, and it still has all the original cupping table my grandfather used, all this other stuff. My dad was a coffee buyer before me, and so he would bring me in again on a Saturday, what have you, and he'd set up his coffee to cup, and then he'd set up like 2 cups of hot chocolate for me to cup, and we have 2 stools, and we'd sit, and he and I would cup, and that was when I was, little also. So again, very early memories. I worked here, as a kid, all different types. So I pretty much grew up in this building. This building has a lot of really very positive vibes for me. It's almost a second home. It's funny, in the cupping room, when we bring in customers or potential customers, we sit down and we do a demonstration cupping. I've had 2 people over the last probably 15 years literally say, George, there are spirits in this room. I'm not kidding. And they're like dead serious. I'm like, okay. They're like, yeah, they're very happy spirits. And I'm like, I get that, because that cupping room is really my happy place. So anyway, it's a long answer to a short question. So my grandfather came over from Yugoslavia as a young teenager, worked up at the silver mines in Nevada, came down, would socialize in Oakland at the Serbian church here, St. George's Church. He met my grandmother and said, all right, we're going to start a coffee roastery. So he started roasting coffee here in Oakland, 1924. He had 2 boys, and my dad was the younger. Both went to Cal, so the first Vukasins ever go to college. Big deal. The oldest brother, my dad's brother, went on to law school, and he ended up being a federal judge. And so my dad, my grandfather turned to my dad and said, all right, you're it. You're the coffee son. And coffee in the 50s, 60s was not obviously what it is today. So my dad wasn't very happy about it. But because he was forced into it, he and my mom, who they worked together for 49 years, were very hands-off with us. They were like, do what you want. Secretly, they wanted us to come in the business, but they were really, really, really hands-off. And so, come college, I pretty much knew I wanted to go in the coffee business. But, if there's one beautiful thing they did was like, hey, just do what you want. Just find your way. So,
yeah, giving you that opportunity is a real gift. One that your generation and my generation have gotten more so than the generations before, like your father.
sure.
Before we go too far into the weeds, I want to make sure that people listening get a little bit of the history of Peerless Coffee in Oakland. Specifically, one of the reasons we're talking is you're celebrating 100. You're just past 100 years, I believe.
Just
Uh,
about.
if I
At
did
100.
my research there,
Yeah.
that is a long time for any business, much less a coffee business, much less a family business. Could you give us just a quick primer so we know what we're talking about when we say Peerless Coffee in Oakland?
Yeah. So I told you about my grandfather and started the business. He and my grandmother worked together, through the Depression, World War II, you name it. I could go into stories about that. My dad then obviously came in. My grandmother passed away. My dad was married to my mom, so she came and took over the books. So it was my grandfather, my mom, and my dad. And as I mentioned, they were closer to downtown Oakland, really small. I mean, it was basically a basement, maybe 700 square feet where the roaster and everything was, and then a little alcove with an office that was shared by like 4 people. So very, very bootstrap, to say the least. But the unique thing, I think my grandfather was so proud to be an American, and he was absolutely, he was a sponge when it came to learning how to market, learning how to sell. I mean, he thrived at that. And we actually have a museum here at Peerless, which has 50 plus years worth of my mom's collecting of coffee antiques, and we have all the old signage that used to hang in the original Peerless in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And I mean, if you come here, by the way, you're welcome to come visit anytime you'd like.
Thank you.
You'll see, fresh roasted, ground before your eyes. I mean, these are phrases, in the 50s that, you know, now it's commonplace, fresh coffee, of course, and whole bean and grinded fresh. But back then it was really unique. And that was all my grandfather. And he just thrived at being able to market coffee to people that, even at the time that maybe they weren't quite ready to, embrace that type of quality culture. But, being in the Bay Area, there was always someone. And we ended up, even though the bulk of the business has and still is focused on restaurants, hotels, cafes, up until probably the 80s, almost the 90s, we were served at the top 10, maybe top 15 restaurants in Northern California consistently. Because we were the best. And, nowadays you can throw a rock and hit a coffee roaster, but back then you really couldn't. And so we grew up in really high end white tablecloth, fine dining. And we always focused our products from a quality perspective to be able to meet or exceed the chefs of the world.
Was there a motivator to go for quality over quantity, especially at that time in history? I mean, the army is giving out contracts for coffee in the 30s and the 40s, but quality wasn't something people were thinking about. Coffee was something you sat in the fridge or in the back of the closet until you needed it.
That's actually a really good question. I can only think that the male side of my family, and this is, I'll make sure my mom doesn't hear this, but we're cooks. We love to cook. So my dad was a phenomenal cook. My grandfather was a phenomenal cook. And I say cook versus chef because they were much more throw stuff together and it just magically tasted good. They weren't, following really strict recipes. And so there was a real desire for quality, to be perfectly honest with you. And so I think that drove, my grandfather and my dad as well as me, because sure, we have lots of opportunities to take on, large chunks of business, but I couldn't use the beans we actually roast. I'd have to find something a little more affordable, to put it nicely. And I have zero interest in that. That's just not fun. It's no knock if someone else does it and they do it great, wonderful. That's just not what our focus is, and that's not how I was raised in the coffee industry.
You mentioned that by college you kind of knew you wanted to be in coffee. I'm thinking about, coming to work and work with your father. Now you're the CEO, the president, you're buying coffee. Where did you start with the company at that point when it was more of
cleaning
a...
cleaning toilets. No, have to think about it. If I haven't done every job here, I've done 99% of the jobs. And my dad was, he learned from his dad, you need to be able to do anything you ask someone else to do. And so that's kind of, honestly, that's really where I started. And summers we're doing that, whether it's janitorial or shipping or production. I learned to roast when I was like 12. So I've always had a roasting background. So anyway, so I've done virtually everything inside this building. But I think where I really actually started as full time was as assisting my dad in coffee buying. We've always held that there's really two components that have made us successful for 100 years, and it's our people and it's our product. And so I'm responsible for both. And I initially back in the beginning when I first joined, my dad was responsible for the people and the product, the coffee. And he wanted me to teach me, how to buy green coffee. So he was my mentor there, and then he kind of obviously shaped me and mentored me in how to best manage and support and coach people. And so it really began, coffee buying. So I graduated college. I knew I was coming to the business. I love to cook, and I knew that I was going to interact with chefs. So I moved to Paris, went to culinary school, got my diplôme de cuisine from Le Cordon Bleu. I then came back. I was going to do a stage, but my dad called me back because he needed some help. Someone who was helping him moved on. I said, I'd love to do it, but the first thing I want to do, which I think is the most important thing, is I want to know where coffee comes from. So I actually moved to Mexico, and I worked for a coffee exporter for about 8 months. And I lived in Chiapas and Oaxaca. And that gave me just enormous appreciation of the difficulty of farming. And it's farming anything. So if you farm something, I have a lot of love for you. But that also allowed me to better understand how coffee's grown, how it's milled, the whole process, the costing behind the process. It was just a phenomenal education for me. And then I came back and I literally, from this office, I'm pointing to the door. I had a desk right outside that door. And And so my dad and I would just talk, communicate without leaving desks. And for probably about 5 years, that was how it was, as I kind of learned the secrets of coffee buying.
When I went to work for my dad, my desk was in the basement. I'm not sure what he
Yeah.
meant by that, but in 2019, Peerless won Roaster of the Year, Roast Magazine's Roaster of the Year, big deal award. With the type of history you have behind you, did you look at that as a recognition of the work you had done, or was that a reflection of where you were in 2019 and where you are now?
Wow, that's a very good question. So, Roast Magazine's Roaster of the Year, it's not a lifetime achievement award. It is, what are you contributing now to the industry, which I think is great, because we might qualify and win a lifetime achievement award based on our history, but I'm just so much more appreciative of being recognized by our peers for what we're doing now to the industry. And a unique thing about us, and there's pros and cons to it. We're a family business. A lot of family businesses tend not to. Marketing is not the biggest component of their budget. Startups, marketing can be the biggest component of your budget. And so we tend to kind of keep our head down and just do our work as best we can and try and execute well. And that's really historically our focus. We don't really tout ourselves. But a unique thing about us is that somehow we stumble upon recognition. And Roast Magazine was an example. If you go back even earlier, the San Francisco Chronicle had the only 6-7 page full section dedicated to coffee. It was back in the 90s. And they did a taste test. They went and grabbed Colombian from, 14 roasters. And we not only won, but we won by a lot against big name local roasters. And people were like, Peerless, I've never heard of it, like shocked. And again, it's another example of, if we just do what we do as best as we can, we don't need to worry about, getting accolades for it. If you do it well, and if you garner the respect of your industry, then accolades will follow. And so we were very humbled to get that award, because that award is really two parts. One is you have to submit what it is you're contributing to the industry in a variety of ways. I won't go into detail. And then if throughout the industry you are deemed worthy of becoming a finalist, and I might be telling you something you already know, but if you're deemed finalist, then you send whatever coffee that you feel best represents you, to multiple tasters, and they cup you, and whoever gets the best score wins. And so, we won on quality, and we won on the type of business that we are.
One thing I think would be easy to do as a company with a long lifespan is kind of rest on your laurels a little bit
Sure.
and just kind of, this is how we've always done it. It's easy to do it. We got this down pat. I was reading that as part of your 100th anniversary, you're releasing a regenerative organic coffee, which isn't something I see a lot of. In fact, I haven't even seen that as a registered marked term that often. What's different between an organic coffee and a rock, a regenerative organic coffee, and why take on a new challenge like that?
Sure. Let me answer the first part, and then I'll kind of get into the rock certification. I know a lot of family roasters throughout the multi-generational, older than us family roasters across the country, and if I've identified anything, I've identified that if you're not nervous, looking behind your back, paying attention to competition, paying attention to trends, trying to figure out where that fad is going to go, you are going to, whether you like it or not, on purpose, rest on your laurels, and you're going to get into I wouldn't call it a rut, but a certain level of performance that's going to be really hard to dig out of. It used to be easier when you could only get a good cup of coffee at a first tier city, by population, not by quality. Just nowadays, you can go to a small town in the middle of Iowa, and there's going to be a roaster there that's crushing it and doing well. And so a lot of these family businesses, they pretty much controlled, their area, and they really didn't have to worry. And a lot of them didn't. And next thing you know, they're no longer in business, or they've had to sell. So what we have consciously done is, one, we stayed in the Bay Area. we're in an area called Jack London Square. It's probably one of the nicest parts of Oakland. We used to be surrounded by food manufacturers. They're all gone. They're all gone because they went to Central Valley for lower costs. They went out of state for lower costs, lower. They're in businesses that's conducive for them. We are not. Our competition, particularly in food service, isn't the big national, brands. It's the small regional third wave roasters, the ones that are doing things really, really phenomenally well from a quality perspective. And so if I go into the middle of nowhere, I'm not going to be, they're not going to be front and center. And I think that's vital for a company like us, is to be surrounded by the next cool roaster. And I mean cool not in a generic way. I mean, actually, they're doing really, really well, and they're doing something differently, because that forces us to adapt and change. And so that's been very intentional on our part, is to stay here. And I think it's been successful. So going back to the regenerative organic, is basically a farm that's creating a carbon sink, right? So it's not just carbon neutral; it's actually literally benefiting, the ecosystem and us in terms of lifestyle, et cetera. And so what we identified regenerative organic. We weren't the first roaster. There were probably two or three that offered something maybe 3 years ago. And then we bought our first 2 years ago. And I said, you know what, you have to have an anniversary coffee. And what a phenomenal example of kind of what's in our DNA in terms of we're regenerative. We will constantly evolve and change, keep our core principles. Those don't change, but we can always kind of grow and develop and adapt to the always changing, coffee landscape. I hearken it to, there's a band in New Orleans called Rebirth, and it's a jazz band. And, some people move on, new people come in. Some people move on, and it's constantly, it's called Rebirth for a reason. I kind of look at us in kind of the same manner, whereas we're always trying to, we're never cutting edge, we're not third wave, et cetera, but we want to know what they're doing, and we want to do the best of class things they're doing, and not waste our time on some of the, less important.
Regenerative is a term that's growing just in awareness, I think. The Kernza grain is a grain I think of when you think about regenerative grains that are starting to get farmed,
Sure.
even right here in the United States. But using your anniversary as a platform to share that, I think, has a lot of value to a greater audience than just coffee. You mentioned businesses that were around you that no longer are, which makes me think of Oakland, the Bay Area being on the forefront of a lot of cultural shifts in American history, coffee history. You're referencing other hip, cool coffee places. That's a place where that's happening. How has Oakland helped shape your company and you? I mean, you're a lifelong, Bay Area resident.
So Oakland as a city has been very good to my family for three generations. Oakland is going through some challenges right now. I'm an optimist. I think at some point we will overcome those challenges. I'm not quite ready to bet on when, but I'm very appreciative. It's been a good city for us, and I think we've contributed enormous amount to the city as well, and that's been acknowledged in multiple ways. So it's been extremely symbiotic, and I love the city. I grew up in the city. Obviously we've had this business here in Oakland for 100, and the community. We have a cafe. One thing that I'll go back to the original Peerless. In why he did it, I have no idea why. But my grandfather, even though he was selling primarily to hospitality and restaurants, he had a counter where you could walk up and buy a pound of coffee. 1924, you could walk up and buy a pound of coffee, and you could buy a pound of peanuts. Where peanuts and coffee merged, it's funny. A lot of family coffee roasters used to, and some still do, sell nuts. It's kind of interesting, and so we still offer that. So when my parents built this building, my mom said, we're going to keep that. We're going to build a cafe. And of course, Jack London Square at the time was just no man's land. It was kind of tied to the port. There's pictures of tumbleweeds kind of rolling down the street. I mean, there was nothing here, and people were like, you're nuts. And my mom was like, no, no. And so at the time, in the mid-'70s, there were only 3 gourmet bean shops in the Bay Area. It was us, it was the original Pete's on Vine Street, and a place in San Francisco called Caravanserai, and we actually sold them all their coffee. So we're the longest, it sounds crazy, but over the counter, consecutively operating bean shop easily in the West Coast. And I when I started exploring that, integrity is a really, really important word for my family. So I said, if I'm going to say something, I'll do some homework to make sure it's accurate. So we actually hired a researcher at the Cal Library. And sure enough, they went through everything. They're like, yeah, you are by far the only one around that is still consistently doing it. We're not the oldest cafe. Obviously, there's cafes in North Beach that have been around a long time, but we are that. And so, and let me tie that in Oakland. So we've built enormous community in Oakland and the neighboring communities through that as well. And we have, customers that have been buying coffee for 50, 60 years that are still coming in, buy their pound of coffee. Many of them remember the original. They used to go to the old Peerless. And so that local community connection is made in multiple ways. One is our little cafe that's built that connection with service and quality and coffee, basically. And then my family historically been very active, whether it's politics or volunteering in the city, in the local community. And then it's any kind of philanthropies that we donate to. So there's a lot of kind of intricacies and interconnectivities between our business and the city.
We've been talking about a lot of history. Obviously, 100 years makes you reflect, but I'm wondering, where do you see Peerless going? And is there going to be a 4th generation at the helm at some point?
Well, my kids are 13 and 11. So nothing's going to happen imminently.
You started roasting at 12. I don't
That's
see
true.
how it's any different.
And both my kids have pulled roast. So you're right. So anyway, so the 4th generation, we're not at the point where we're thinking that. Both my sister and I are pretty young.
I'm not trying to push you out the door or anything.
Yeah, no, I know. But I get that. That's usually a question that I get asked. And, it's interesting. I'll go back. My parents faced that question also. And my dad got a call from the former head of commodities for Nestle, who was based in San Francisco at the time. He was based in San Francisco. He wanted to come over and meet my parents. And my dad wasn't sure. He thought it was a social call. They knew each other. And he comes and he proceeds to say, I want to buy Peerless. And my mom and my dad were like, whoa. And so my dad said, well, why do you think I want to sell? And the gentleman looked straight at my dad and says, because you're too old. And my dad got all upset and kind of, what are you talking about? He goes, look, your kids are 13, 14, 15, whatever age we were. He goes, you're going to have to put in another, 10, 15 years before you even know and feel confident that they could be the next generation. So let me just make it a lot easier for you, and I'll buy the business. And so, of course, my parents went home, and they thought about, and they came out of that meeting and thought, nope, we're going to build. We're going to build. If they come, great, but we're not ready to let go of this business. And so that was kind of their moment where they committed to, we're going to build this business, create this as best we can, a situation so that, assuming children are qualified and they prove to be qualified, then we want them to, go have fun in 3rd generation and keep building upon what we've been building.
Well, you've mentioned we a lot. I believe your sister also came back and works with the company as well. Working in a family business, there's family dynamics at play. How have you managed to keep both of those worlds, in a stable place? Because I know that I've worked with my dad and my wife and my brothers, and sometimes the overlap, when it's yours and you're passionate about it, it leaves the office with you, I would imagine.
So number one, we had incredible role models with my mom and dad. They worked together for 49 years, and I couldn't even imagine. They went home, they worked their 8, 9, 10 hours, then go home and probably talked about business, the business for the next 2, 3 hours. So fortunately, we have a little separation as my wife is not involved. But so number one, we've had incredible mentors in my parents. who've kind of shown us the way of what to do and what not to do, just not sitting us down teaching us, but just by example. And my sister was really clear. She's got a legal background, so she keeps me out of any kind of legal trouble, which is very helpful. She doesn't necessarily want to run the business. She just wants to have a really active, vital role, and I really want to run the business, or I'm very comfortable running the business. And so we were able to kind of you start with that. Obviously, if you have two siblings that both want to run the business, then you got to figure out how to manage that. So you start off that way, which is good. And then separation of powers. I mean, this is kind of the checklist that you meet with any kind of family business consultant. But separation of powers is very helpful. And then last but not least, obviously, is communication. Without a doubt, communication is probably the most important. Good and bad, easy communication, hard communication. It's very similar to a marriage. The more you communicate, the better off you're going to be.
We have this other program that we do called Coffee Smarter. And as I'm listening to you talk, I'm pulling things out of it that I would use on that show at some point. I'd be like, man, we talked about this over here. I'm wondering if you have a piece of advice that you would pass on to somebody who's looking at starting a coffee business now in this environment, which is a different world than the one that you started.
I've been thinking about that. And I'm sure I have a really easy answer, but I'm going to throw something different. And this is for people if they aren't necessarily tied to a community. If you're tied to a community for whatever reason, by personal mission or what have you, then obviously, build, get that first, dig that first shovel in and build your legacy there. But if you aren't, and this ties into kind of the state of Oakland now, and that is, I was talking to someone, this is going to be random, so just I'll circle back. I was talking to someone who's very knowledgeable with the NFL and MLB and a variety of professional sports. And they were talking because, we Oakland's lost the Raiders, we lost the Warriors, San Francisco, we just lost the A's. And we were talking about, number one, relocation, and number two, when MLB adds new teams, like what's the criteria? Obviously, the biggest one is who's going to cut the biggest check, right? That's kind of the secret, the open secret. But the other thing he brought up is they will study the demographics of the cities, and they want cities that are growing. They will not negate, but they will note cities that are flat or shrinking. And I've had a lot of friends that have moved to Nashville, and I was in Nashville just a couple months ago. And in Nashville, you go there and there's, 17, 18, 20 building cranes. You come to Oakland, there's one. And so where I'm going is if you're going to start a business, and again, if you don't have a tie to a particular community, I have a tie to Oakland, so I'm not going anywhere. But boy, I would go to a city that every day is winning. I mean, because, if you drive around a city that isn't, you see those vacancy signs. And I mean, boy, that vacancy sign, it's been there a year. And so you start seeing that stuff. If you go to a city that's booming and building and developing, there's a vibe, there's an energy. And you look and you go, boy, that vacancy sign was only up for a day. And now somebody's going to fill. I mean, that's a powerful motivator, I think, for entrepreneurs that are starting a business. Because operating a business here, Nashville, is the same troubles that you're going to deal with. But it makes it a lot more, I wouldn't say easier per se, but boy, it more maybe rewarding, and it gives you fuel to tackle those challenges. And so it would be kind of interesting if I was tied to Oakland, I was 20 something, I said, hey, I want to start a cafe. I would try to find a city, town, doesn't have to be a city or town, that has that future. And I'd let that fuel me. And hopefully, that will lead to my success. And, I can turn that success into giving back to the city. And it's like this flywheel concept, I think.
Very wise commentary from 100 feet up. I'm wondering what I didn't ask you today that we really want people to know, or that I should have asked you.
I think you asked about where Peerless is going, and I don't think I answered.
Well, let's knock that out of the park, though. We got a few minutes.
I think I went on a tangent, but you did say tangents are okay. So
Totally okay. Sorry about the baseball pun. I watched the last few Brewers games in Oakland recently,
yeah,
and
yeah.
big Brewers fan myself and big baseball fan. So
Going back about 8 years, 8 years pre-COVID, there were a lot of opportunities, which I won't go into detail, that I was faced with. A lot of investments, a lot of this, a lot of that, and I found myself kind of stuck or overwhelmed with all of that to the point where I wasn't moving. So the day-to-day operation, great, everything was growing, and nothing like that. But it was more larger kind of strategic initiatives that we were looking at doing. And so the solution, which was so simple, is to say, we're going to turn 100 in 8 years. So I'm going to do everything to make that successful and build into that. That's going to be my goal and my focus. Anything that I'm having trouble deciding on is just going to be pushed to the side. And it was so liberating because it's just like, okay, we want a second facility. Then it's like, where, all this other stuff. Now let's put that aside. Let's just focus on being the best business in Oakland, growing in Oakland, taking care of our customers, building into our 100th as best we can. And so that was extremely liberating. But now you catch me that I've already now hit that. And so I'm sitting there going, okay, I'm going to have to put some of this stuff kind of back on the table. We're very fortunate in that we have a very, successful business. COVID, other issues are obviously, we got hit just like anyone else. But, in the end, we haven't just survived, we're actually thriving, which is great. And so we want to continue to build on that. And we're using, our first 100 years as fuel to tackle the next 100. And so as I hearken back to what we were talking about regarding competition and knowing what the third wave, but really a lot of it is me, I pay attention to what other newer roasters are doing. They may not be our main competitor now, and most won't, because most probably won't figure out hospitality, that type of segment. But someone will, and they're going to do it well. And so I'm trying to figure out, all right, in 10 years, where do we need to be to intersect with them to be able to compete at that high level? And so there's a constant amount of that doing. I'm really focusing, honestly, on the next decade. There's a whole bunch of strategic initiatives that we're rolling out in a couple of years, which I won't bore you with. But I'm already thinking, okay, Peerless 2110. I mean, we're 110. Where are we going to be? And so it kind of gives you more of a 32,000 foot answer. But, in businesses like us, we think in decades. We're not thinking in years, which on one hand is scary, big commitment, et cetera, et cetera. But we're very comfortable with it. And we like to focus on the long term versus short term.
Well, your foundation already runs deep. I have a feeling if we talk again in 10 years from now, a lot of things will have changed, but I bet that wood in the back wall there stays the same.
This wood, just to let you know, so when my parents built this building in 1975, my mom used a concrete tilt-up. She's like, okay, there's no romance in concrete tilt-ups, a lot of romance in coffee. So she found a lumber mill that was being dismantled in Mendocino. And the guy said, you can have the wood, just get it off. So it's the whole original office was built with this 200-year-old wood, which is incredible.
If you are out and about, you're kind of exploring, new coffee shop pops up in Oakland. Let's say somebody opens doors right down the street. They look like they kind of know what they're doing. What are you going to order?
Well, so I'd start with a black coffee just because I want to see what their base coffee is. And then, cappuccino, something like that. But I would definitely start with a base coffee and maybe hit it a couple times, check consistency. It's funny, a lot of, if you take roasting, for instance, there's the roasting aspect, obviously, and profile roasting and things like that. But then there's the cooling. If you go back 20 years ago, there were plenty of people, who were new on the scene that really focused on how to roast. But then, they would cool their coffee in 5 minutes, or the cooling would change. And there wasn't a focus on that. And that created inconsistencies. And so, that was an easy capitalization on our part because people don't like inconsistent coffee. So I look at that the same kind of way. I'd go to the cafe, and are they being able to, execute consistently or not? Those that do, I have enormous respect, absolutely enormous respect. But unfortunately, there's plenty that don't.
That's always the biggest challenge, especially when you have a name on a bag that looks the same, but the person on the other side, that's the consumer, maybe isn't realizing, well, this is a different lot, this is a different season, things change over time, and a business that can keep things consistent and work with the variables so the consumer doesn't feel that is always going to come out ahead in the long run.
Yeah, we had a customer, they retired, but it's a restaurant in Oakland called Beowulf. And they were very similar to Chez Panisse, which garnered a lot more accolades. But they came from that generation, and these owners just were a little more low-key than Chez Panisse. And I went there with my dad, I don't know, I'm probably not even making this up, 100 times for lunch. And I never once had an off meal. Never once. Now, could you go to another restaurant and get something fancier? Sure. And it was very good. But I was just astounded at their ability to execute at a high level consistently. And so I have enormous respect. And there's plenty that do it in coffee. But I have enormous respect for people that are able to do it, because it takes, it's work, and it's constant work. And it's not just, hey, here are the rules, here are the recipes, execute. It's constantly testing and checking. So as well as I do. And so that's really where that dedication is pretty impressive.
George, I want to say thank you for spending this time with me. I know time is always a priority. I really enjoyed hearing the story and honestly relating to it as someone who grew up in his family's business and worked with his parents. Every time you're saying something, you might see me smile and nod, and it's because I'm going, oh yeah, I remember that. I remember that feeling. Congrats on 100 years, and hopefully I'll be around for the next 100.
I love it. Yeah, and like I said, please come visit me. Come on by. We'll cup some coffee, and I'll give you a tour of the museum.
I would love that. Okay, some key takeaways from the podcast. George is the third generation at the helm of the family business. As a child, he'd take naps on stacks of burlap coffee sacks and cup side by side with his father. Of course, his mugs were filled with hot chocolate instead of coffee. It would have been easy, even likely, for George to rebel against joining the family legacy. But because his father wasn't really offered a lot of choices in his career path, both of George's parents made an effort to stay hands-off with their children, offering them the freedom to take another path, which made the decision to stick with coffee and join the business George Jr.'s own. That continuing legacy is why Peerless has its own coffee museum. Consistency over time is one of the greatest challenges any business will face, as is adapting to new expectations from the consumer force. And Peerless has worked through that, generation after generation, into this generation. They've been offering their customers, primarily high-end wholesale quality seekers, good coffee, which I think is interesting, because that wouldn't have been the most profitable route to go when George's grandfather was first starting out. I mentioned the coffee contracts being offered by the military, and I really suggest that you check out the book Uncommon Grounds. There's a lot of history in there about how coffee was being prioritized for military use only, and the contracts being given out were not small, especially because after World War II started, coffee producers ran into a ton of supply chain issues, making coffee relatively scarce. So scarce that the United States instituted a rationing program for coffee for general citizens. I'll link to that book and share a little bit more in the newsletter. At the beginning of his career, George moved to Mexico to gain a better understanding of coffee at the production level, and that experience has shaped his perspective as the primary buyer of coffee for Peerless Coffee and Tea. Some of that perspective helped lead to the Centennial Anniversary Blend coffee that I mentioned earlier in the show. It's a Regenerative Organic Certified Coffee, or ROC. The blend of beans comes from farms in Nicaragua and Colombia. Established in 2017, the ROC label is the first certification program to standardize criteria and benchmarks for coffee production that account for things like soil health, land management, animal welfare, and farmer-worker fairness. The ROC label aims for a carbon-neutral footprint to guarantee full transparency in the supply chain and to ensure that farmers grow crops using regenerative practices. Basically, regenerative coffees are not just carbon neutral, but produced in a manner that helps reduce carbon and improve the environment beyond the farm. Finally today, I get a little verklempt with dad stuff. I'm getting teary-eyed thinking about working with my dad right now, and also remembering that closing scene in Field of Dreams, where they play catch. Family dynamics can be just as complicated as work politics. When you put them together, you could be lighting a match next to a gunpowder keg, and the result could be an explosion. Or in the case of the Vukasins, some lovely fireworks. Thanks to George for coming on the Coffee People podcast and for the coffee I'm drinking today. Head to peerlesscoffee.com or at Peerless Coffee on Instagram for more details on their 100-year celebrations, their coffees, their efforts in Oakland, and updates on the next 100 years of their growth, which I'm hoping to be around for. You'll find those links and more key takeaways from today's podcast, and even see what we're listening to with our coffees in this week's edition of the newsletter, found online at coffeepeoplepodcast.com. You'll also see tickets for Trailfest, where I'll be serving coffee to thirsty campers and mountain bikers next month. Trailfest is a weekend-long camp-out and bike event that serves as a fundraiser for the San Diego Mountain Biking Association. It's 3 days of bike demos, campfires, happy hours, stargazing, and of course, great coffee in the Cleveland National Forest east of San Diego. Again, tickets on the newsletter. To all of you listening, thank you for doing so. If you're on the Apple or the Spotify platforms, please tap the follow button and give us as many stars as you feel we've earned. Your reviews do help other people find us, and you can also support the show by just telling your friends. We're always telling our Coffee People friends about Roastar coffee packaging, found at roastar.com. They are this podcast's presenting sponsor, and we couldn't do it without them. They go out of their way to help you tell the big story of your small businesses. They've got a pretty cool design lab on their website for coffee roasters and home roasters alike. That's roastar.com. We're also supported by some great coffee industry partners. They include Zumbar Coffee and Tea, Steady State Roasting, Coffee Cycle Roasting, Maria Coffee, Cape Horn Green Coffee Importers, Crossings Coffee, Hasea Coffee Source, Ignite Coffee Company, Ascend Coffee Roasters, Civets Roasting Machines, who are actually known for their roasted peanuts in addition to their fluid airbed roasting machines. Me and My Uncle Coffee, Craft 42 Roasters, and Cozy Canine Coffee. I want to make sure that I say congrats to Coffee Cycle Roasting, who just opened their second location in Ocean Beach, and to Camp Coffee Company, who are celebrating their 5th anniversary in Oceanside, California. Thank you for listening, for sharing this podcast, for asking me questions, and for being coffee curious. This show, the Coffee People Podcast, is part of the Roast West Coast Coffee Network. This episode has been written, produced, researched, and recorded by me, Ryan Woldt. I hope this episode has found you happy, healthy, and with at least a thread of sanity left, enabling you to make it through the day. Always tip your baristas, and be sure to drink good coffee. Oh, and I forgot. We have a new shop. You can get Roast West Coast merch. Look for that link in the show notes or on our website. New t-shirts, new hats, all kinds of cool stuff. Thanks, everybody. Hey, everyone. This is Ryan, the host of the Coffee Smarter and Coffee People podcasts, which are part of roastwestcoast.com. I don't do a lot of affiliate marketing on these shows, but I recently partnered with 3 brands that have been good to me for the long haul. And I mean good to me like in my personal life. They're things I use every day. They include Hydro Flask. We've got the water bottle and we beat the crap out of it. We love it. Also Baratza. I use Baratza grinders at home. I used them when I was working in the cafe, and I found them to be consistent, durable, and frankly a company that I feel values the customer. Finally, Simply Good Coffee. They've been our longest affiliate partner. I use a Simply Good Coffee brewer at home. I think it's a great, affordable coffee brewer. I've probably run 600-700 coffee batches through mine, and it's just cranking them out one after another. The one I'm drinking right now tastes fantastic. If you want to support this show and you're interested in buying a Hydro Flask, a Baratza grinder, or a new coffee brewer, please click the links that we share in our show notes, or look for our reviews. We do in-depth reviews on these products. We don't just do them on any product, and they don't pay us for them. But I want you to know that I actually believe this thing I'm saying right now. And if you do click those links to buy a product, they will kick back a little bit of affiliate money to us, which helps us produce these shows. Thank you for supporting Roast West Coast by listening and by clicking those links, and enjoy your new gear. We certainly appreciate it. Head to roastwestcoast.com to check out the reviews. A new one on the Baratza grinder coming soon, and we'll catch up with you later. Cheers. If you are in the early stages of your coffee journey, we want to support you. Check out the Coffee Smarter Education podcasts. Coffee Smarter is designed to enable coffee drinkers to brew a better cup of coffee at home. And Coffee Smarter Pro covers industry-specific topics for baristas, roasters, shop owners, and aspiring coffee professionals. You'll find both shows on your favorite podcast platforms or on our website at coffeesmarterpodcast.com.